Welcome back to A Timey Wimey Pod, where we watch every episode of Doctor Who from 2005 onwards. My name's Rebecca,
I'm Haley.
and today we are discussing 42. We are back into Series 3.
And it feels really good to be back in Series 3, but this episode is the first Chris Chibnall episode that we are covering on our podcast.
It sure is. We have our own thoughts and feelings about Chris Chibnall related to his future writings on the show, but we won't let that impact today's discussion. However, many of the problems in this episode also exist during his run as showrunner.
Yeah,
Are you ready for some fantastic facts?
of course I am.
Like we said, this episode was written by Chris Chibnall. It was directed by Graham Harper, and it aired May 19th, 2007. Abby Lerner, who is played by Vanette Robinson, later goes on to play Rosa Parks in the episode Rosa, which is one of the first Chris Chibnall episodes during his time as showrunner.
That's so crazy, actually.
Yeah, I never knew that until I was looking it up for this episode.
Yeah, same.
The ship that they were on was originally called SS Icarus. You know, we all know who that is. I don't think I have to explain. But they changed it because the same year a movie called Sunshine came out, which has a spaceship by the same name. And it seems like kind of a similar movie or plot, but I didn't really look too much into it. And then my last fantastic fact is that the episode name is kind of supposed to match up, with the whole premise. They have 42 minutes to not die, and 42, kind of similar to the runtime of the episode. And it was also like a slight homage to the show 24.
Very interesting.
Yeah. If you don't know the show 24, it's like a popular American show that was really big, like around this time, kind of mid 2000s. And like every episode is an hour of time. Yeah, it's kind of hard to explain.
Yeah. First season is good. I haven't watched anything past that, but that's really interesting that they wanted to pay homage to 24.
It makes sense. Like 24, American Idol, that was 2007 in a nutshell.
It really was.
Yeah. Are you ready to jump into the episode?
Yes, I am.
Now, this is the 7th episode of the season, and Martha is finally an official companion.
It is about time. We have mentioned time and time again in the past 6 episodes of the season. She did not get her due, and she finally has it. It only took 7 episodes and almost a full season, but she's here. She's a full companion, and still she deserves so much more, but at least she's a companion now.
Yeah, finally. No, seeing her phone get zapped, sonicked, whatever you want to call it, made me really happy.
Me too.
Now, this episode is like The Impossible Planet and The Satan Pit if those episodes were bad.
Yeah, so going into this episode, I didn't remember any of the plot. I literally did not remember anything except for one brief snippet of David Tennant and his eyes glowing. That's literally all I remembered about this episode. So going in, it was almost like a new episode, but when I watched it, it was very forgettable even as I was watching it. And after I watched it, I forgot even more. Like, the crew wasn't really personable to me. They were kind of just very bland. The concept is there, but the way it was executed just it captivated me to enough to watch the full episode, but barely. It wasn't good. It wasn't terrible, like the worst, but it just at the same time wasn't a good episode.
Yeah, I like the premise. I like the whole thing. The engines are down, 42 minutes, they're gonna fall into the sun. I even like the trivia bit where they're trying to get through all the doors and they have to answer all these trivia questions. I even like that aspect. But yeah, the crew is so boring. They have no personalities. We don't learn anything about them except for the fact that Corwin and Kath are married. That's all. That's their entire thing. And we don't know anything else about this crew. And I'm going to talk about the Impossible Planet and the Satan Pit a lot in this episode because I feel like visually they are very similar. And I think they were trying to kind of match those episodes here, which obviously didn't happen. But in those episodes, that crew is so iconic. Like everyone still talks about those characters, and we in our episodes went on and on about how much we were interested in the crew. And there's also just small moments that told you who these people were and their fears and their motivations. And we don't get any of that in this episode. We have no idea who these characters are.
Yeah, even later in this episode, Martha kind of has a moment with Riley, and I don't know, it kind of felt out of nowhere to me. Like we didn't get a ton there. Like just this whole crew, we didn't have any small moments that showed their personalities, except for that like one girl who was complaining that everyone like ordered her around before she was killed.
Yeah, and it's almost like Riley's purposefully written to have no personality, because he even when they're dying later on the escape pod, he's like, yeah, I have no family, no friends, mom I haven't spoken to in 6 years, which is like, why write it that way, you know?
Yeah. And I will be honest, I really did give this episode a chance. We haven't gotten into talking much about it until now, but Rebecca, you mentioned at the beginning of this episode that Chris Chibnall is not our favorite showrunner or writer, so obviously we do have a bias towards him, but I did really try to give this episode a chance. So I'm not just saying this is a bad episode just because Chris Chibnall wrote it.
No.
Even if someone else wrote this episode, I would still have the same opinions because it's just very forgettable.
Even before he ever became showrunner, this episode was never like one I thought about or had any, attachment to.
Exactly.
I do like Erica. She's the one that was complaining about getting ordered around. I did laugh when she said, just kill me now, and then she dies. I thought that was really funny.
That was actually really funny.
What do you think of the villain in this episode, which is I don't even really want to say villain, because it's more just the sun kind of defending itself, but then the sun possesses some of the crew. So what did you think of that?
I mentioned before, I just don't love possession storylines in really any medium in any show or movie. I didn't really mind it in this episode though, and maybe it's because this crew just wasn't very personable, so it really didn't affect me emotionally. I don't quite know what it was. So like it wasn't my favorite, but I didn't hate it. And I don't blame the sun for defending itself because they were being shady with it.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think it's a interesting premise, like I said before, like the sun's fighting back, but it really just feels that they are trying to copy the Impossible Planet and the Satan Pit. Like even the catchphrase is like burn with me, and like the way it just really feels like they're trying to bring that back. Like I half expected an Ood to show up in this episode.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. It really just feels like it was almost like a copy, and I think that's why another reason why it's so forgettable. It's not just like how it was written and the characters in this. It's that it literally feels like a copy or some sort of replication of the Impossible Planet and Satan Pit from series 2. And when you're in a new series with a new companion, you don't really want that. So it is interesting that they greenlit this episode, and maybe originally it was supposed to be a little bit different, or they didn't see all the similarities. But yeah.
Another issue I have with this episode is that we don't get to see Corwin before he gets possessed, or how he gets possessed, or anything. Like when we meet him, he is just like passed out. And then next thing we know, he's been taken over. And we know Kath, the captain, and that's her husband, and she has all this sympathy for him and all these like emotions, of course. But we don't get to know him ourselves. We didn't get just even like a scene of him before he goes out of the spaceship would have, I don't know, been something. But again, there's just like no work into the characterization of any of these characters.
Completely agree with you on that.
Yeah, because it just makes, like, if we don't know him, then it's hard to understand the relationship between him and Kath. So when she's, making mistakes and trying to fight for him and going down to the engine or whatever they're doing in this episode, honestly, it would make it more understandable because we would know who she's trying to fight for, who she's trying to reach. But it just makes her look like a bad captain when we don't understand that relationship or their dynamic.
Yeah. And also with Kath being the captain, she did feel very like one-dimensional and one note, and she was basically just running this whole episode, and I think that added to it as well.
I think there's a fair bit like she's giving more than anyone else is. She's given more to do than anyone else, but yeah, I think they're just overall, like we've already said, we just don't know these characters and they're not really given a lot of depth or personality.
Yeah. Now, I do have a question, and I don't know if there's an actual answer to this, but if the people who are possessed by the sun are burning people, which like ends in their death, what's the point of the helmet?
Yeah, what is the point of the helmet?
Like, is it just for looks? Like, I kind of feel like it's probably just for looks. Like, that's why they included it.
This is such a one-dimensional villain. And the helmet is just supposed to look scary, scare kids. And the catchphrase, I hate when it's so obvious that the show is trying to like create a scary catchphrase. Like they're trying to have the new exterminate. Like they were really trying with burn with me. And you can just tell they're trying to create a toy, essentially. They're trying to get kids to buy the guy with the helmet saying burn with me. And it just doesn't work in this case.
That is actually such a great point. And yeah, like nothing about the helmet really makes any sense besides what you just mentioned.
Yeah, it's really not needed.
Mm-mm.
Now, when Martha and Riley are running away from Corin, why do they get into an escape pod? I know Martha doesn't know it's an escape pod, but he should know it's an escape pod, right? Why would you go hide in a escape pod when you're about to be thrown into the sun?
That's my exact question, because again, Martha wouldn't have known, but Riley would know. Why are you going into an escape pod? That is the most obvious thing a villain would do, is press that button or that lever to disconnect it and send you off barreling towards the sun.
Yeah. And it's one of your crew members or like the body of one of your crew members. So they're going to know exactly which button to push.
Exactly. But I will say the moment when the escape pod is detaching, that actually is a really good scene because there's just no audio on Tenzin. You just see him mouthing to Martha, and Martha's just like hands on the window as she's jetting towards the sun, and that is a really good suspenseful moment.
No, I agree. I think that's the best part of this episode, and that scene has always stayed with me. While this rest of this episode is forgettable, I always think about that scene and the image of Chen mouthing, "I'll save you," and Martha just like her hands pressed against the glass lives rent free in my mind. And I think it's such an iconic image, and they don't get a lot of scenes where we really get to like see the connection between these two and see their friendship, but I think that is one of them, and it's really good.
It is really good. And even the scene between Martha and Riley in the escape pod, when Martha says, "I'll have disappeared and they'll just stay there waiting." And she really has a moment where she realizes that even though she was fighting with her mom earlier in this episode, which I guess we'll get to, we haven't mentioned that yet. At the end of the day, when she's like barreling towards the sun, she realizes that her family will have no idea where she's at.
I know. Yeah, that is crazy. Okay, let's talk about the Martha and Francine storyline in this episode, because this is kind of what you would call, I guess, the C plot of the episode.
Yeah.
Francine has people, doesn't matter, I guess, who they are, but they work for Mr. Saxon, and they are listening to all of Francine and Martha's conversations. Mind you, because Francine, she did this to herself. She let them in.
She really did. And girl, why, again, going back to the Lazarus experiment, why did you listen to that random man who was whispering strange things about the doctor? First of all, stranger danger. Second of all, you would think you would trust your daughter more, would you not?
And then at the end of the episode, she's like, I hope you don't expect me to tell you who I voted for, or whatever she says. I know that's not the exact line. And it's like, girl, you did this to yourself. You decided to trust these random people more than you trusted your daughter. For what? For no good reason. I do love the scene of Martha trying to call her to get the Beatles versus Elvis question.
Yes.
I find that really funny. And if you've ever, been on the phone and tried to get your mom to Google something, it's exactly like that.
Oh, 100%. It doesn't matter that it's been, 17 years since this episode aired? Still the same. Still the exact same.
Yeah.
No, that's great. But can we talk about, the whole door, trivia thing, the way to open the doors was to answer the trivia questions. Interesting premise. But it's giving the vibes of password hints, but the password hints that you never remember the answers to.
Yes, like the one guy who's like, when they're like, oh, what's your favorite color? And he's like, purple. And then he's like, wait, did I say orange? That is so me, because every time I have to set up a security question, I'm like, but what if my answer changes? Like, I hate when they're like, what's your favorite show? What's your favorite? Like, I don't know. My answer will change by the time I have to answer these again. And I'm not going to know what I put.
Yeah, no, I feel you on that. Like, any password hint, unless it's one of the classic cliche, maiden names or your first pet. But even your first pet, what constitutes the first pet? Because at the age of 12, my beta fish does, but at the age of 23, it's my first dog. So
yeah, and there's dogs I had as kids, but we didn't really mesh well, and they weren't really my dog. But then as I got older, I had dogs that I was closer with, so it's I don't know, you know what I mean? It's hard to say.
Yeah,
I don't know what I'm gonna put for that. I just never know what my future self is going to put when they have to answer that question. But going back to this, why were some of the questions pub trivia, Beatles versus Elvis, and some of them were just questions about the crew? It's so inconsistent.
It's very inconsistent. And can I just say, they chose all of these answers after they had drinks. So they weren't sober, which is the worst combination. So you're making password hints and you're not sober.
Let's come up with more security questions while drinking. That seems like a really good idea.
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense they would want security questions in the case they ever got hijacked or anything piracy related. But the way they went about it was just not smart.
No. Going back to Martha talking about her family, I did really like her talking about her family, how they wouldn't know if anything happened to them, and how, Riley, he's talking about how it's just silence between him and his mom, and Martha's talks about, how much noise there is in her family. And I thought that was a really, really interesting comparison and kind of sweet in a way. And something you miss when you're away from your crazy family is just how loud they can be sometimes. You kind of miss the noise sometimes. I also, going back to Corin and Kath, I did like the moment when he at first tells her it's her fault and they don't know what that means. I found that really interesting.
It is really interesting because it's not Corwin. Well, it might have been Corwin saying that deep down there somewhere, but it was mostly, if not all, the sun. And of course, we later learn at the end of this episode, I forget exactly what it was, but they're basically misusing the sun as an energy source or something like that, right?
Yeah, they try to like use the sun for fuel.
Yeah, and so I find that moment interesting too, and just really brutal for her. Like, even though it is very much her fault, she's the captain, like being told that while your husband is possessed by the sun.
Yeah.
Like, that had to hit hard for her. There was also so much running in this episode.
There is. We get the return of the orange spacesuit again. They're trying so hard to be impossible on the planet.
They really are. Was the orange suit warranted for this episode?
Hey, anytime we see the orange suit, I'm happy.
That is so true, actually. Something about the doctor in the orange suit. I don't know what it is.
Something about it. Again, I'm asking, pleading, begging for Ncuti Gatwa in the orange suit.
RTD, you would make us so happy.
We need it. We desperately need it.
We really do. Going back to the main plot of this episode with all of the possessed people by the sun, there's been a few murders, and there's Ashton and there's Corwin, and both of them are being possessed by the sun. Now, it's a little bit confusing because, again, they're not very memorable, unfortunately. So I'm pretty sure it was Ashton and the doctor who had a face-to-face, right?
I believe so.
And then Ashton gets frozen and then dies, and then you see Corwin physically affected when that happens, and then he just walks away. So Ten figures out that, like, if he freezes them, that will just like stop them from killing people.
Another moment that I really like in this episode is after Ten goes outside, saves Martha, Martha comes back, and now he's getting, for lack of a better term, possessed by the sun. And I do really like how just the interactions between Ten and Martha in these moments, and how she has to get him to the stasis chamber, and he's clearly like in a lot of pain, and he even says that he's scared, which is not something we ever hear or see from Ten. And I do really like that moment. And you can tell, he's scared and in pain, because he even starts to try to tell Martha about regeneration, which I just find really interesting.
Can you imagine this is the episode where Ten regenerates?
Stop. No, I thought about that because there's all those like YouTube videos that's like, what if Matt Smith showed up in Journey's End? But like, what if Matt Smith showed up here?
That would actually be insane and diabolical. But yeah, that moment between him and Martha, and him like starting to go through the whole speech about regeneration it's kind of crazy, but I kind of love it.
Yeah, me too. I think David's performance is really great, and I think he plays the, scared, in pain emotions really well. I think they both did a great job playing off of each other in those moments. And really, despite how few scenes they get, and their relationship is not the focus of this episode at all, the moments between the doctor and Martha are the best parts of the episode.
Yeah, they really, really are. But Ten figures out that he can remagnetize the ship, and he can bring the escape pod back that has Martha and Riley in it. So they're safe. He saves the day with them, which is good. So glad that they're going to be okay. And then we learn all the tea. We learn the sun is alive. Then Ten gets possessed. But then we also learn the ship mined the sun for cheap fuel and did not check for life. And Ten has this crazy sequence where he's possessed by the sun, and he's actively fighting it because he's a Time Lord. He has like the strength that humans don't, I guess, but just that whole scene is crazy. And like him directing Martha to freeze him to get the organism out of him. It's a kind of crazy scene.
Yeah, and him yelling at the captain like you should have scanned, like you should have scanned for life, and like the kind of internal battle between him and the son. You can really see it through David's performance, which again I think is really interesting.
Yeah, and 10 sends Martha off to stop the ship from going towards the sun because they got through, figured all the things out. And he also instructed her to give back the sun particles. And after this, Kath the captain takes herself and Corwin after he shut down the stasis chamber, and she and him go out a hatch and burn in the sun.
Mm-hmm.
So that she could save everyone else on board.
Yeah, classic, character sacrifice. I would have more to say if we really knew anything about these characters, but there's not much to say.
The only thing I will say, and I will ask, is why did you choose the sun to mine for fuel? It's so hot.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess that was the only thing nearby, I guess.
Okay, I had absolutely zero recollection of the vibe or whatever weirdness between Martha and Riley. So at the end, when they kiss each other, I was like, what is this? I don't remember this ever being in my mind.
It's so forced. And even when they're in the escape pod, there's a moment where Martha gets off the phone with her mom and she hugs him, and then he kisses her forehead, which is just such an intimate act for someone you've known for 30 minutes, if that, at that point. And yeah, their kiss at the end, it just feels so forced. Like they were really trying to do something. And we've seen the show do this before with Rose, Rose and Adam and Dalek, Rose and Jack and the Empty Child. There's other times, and it works. It makes sense. You can even in Dalek, even though we don't like Adam, you see the connection between him and Rose, or at least the initial kind of flirtatious chemistry. But you really don't get that here. You don't get that same feeling where you're like, okay, I could kind of see it, or there's just not, it just feels so forced.
I completely agree with you. The only redeeming thing after that point truly is 10 finally giving Martha a key to the TARDIS.
Yes. Oh, finally.
It makes me so happy. But what doesn't make me happy is Martha calls her mom, Francine, back. And the tracers are still there. So my question is, how close together were Martha's calls? If they weren't close together, were the tracers there all day just sitting around in silence?
I think they were. I think this was just throughout the day. Francine was getting these crazy calls, and they were just sitting there all day, waiting for Martha. What were they even listening for, really? What was the goal of this? What are they trying to get her to say?
That's actually such a great point. I think they're just interested in the Doctor's activities.
But what, knowing Harold Saxon, what does he need from this? What is the point?
I think he wants to figure out where the Doctor is.
Or he's just trying to keep close tabs on the Joneses. But yeah.
Mind games?
Mind games, yeah.
Drums make you go crazy, so who knows, honestly, with Harold Saxon.
But yeah, and we find out it's election day in Francine's time.
Yep, it is. And that is the end of the episode. So yeah, not a great episode, not the worst either, just very mid.
Yeah, and very, very mid. Every season has one.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll probably skip it on future rewatches like I have done in the past.
Yeah, I think I usually do, honestly. But I do, like I said, I do always think about the moment between Martha and 10 and these escape pod and him, shouting at her. And then when 10 gets possessed and he's in the stasis chamber. Like, I always think about those two moments, and I do think they were done really well. Again, I think it's kind of funny that the best moments are just between David and Freema. Even their TARDIS scenes are nice. But yeah, there's really just nothing else to really take away from this episode. Like, the villain isn't memorable, the crew is completely forgettable. But yeah.
Yeah, but speaking of the TARDIS scene, I forgot to bring it up, but the beginning of this episode starts with Ten and Martha in the TARDIS getting a distress call, and I don't know, the way it's shot and David is acting, it's always so funny to me because it's so much, but I love it, and I love those TARDIS scenes, even if it's just like a small snippet of it, like them as the TARDIS is flying.
Me too, yeah. David using his foot to fly the TARDIS will never not be hilarious.
Yeah.
And I do like the scene at the end where you can see that Ten is very shaken up from what happened, and Martha tries to check in on him, and I love her getting the key, and I guess they're going ice skating, which I would also want to go ice skating after almost being killed by the sun.
Oh, definitely.
Another Impossible Planet Satan Pit connection we didn't talk about is how they make the TARDIS out of commission for a reason I really still don't get, but I guess the room that it was in became too hot, even though they walked through that room not 2 seconds before. But
Yeah. What was the reason?
yeah, I mean, you need to get, I guess you don't want to make it easy for them so they don't just leave on the TARDIS, but it really added to the whole Impossible Planet Satan Pit connection. Again, this episode is just those episodes if those episodes were bad.
Yeah, I completely agree with you.
Do we have any reviews from the past?
Yes, we do. We have a couple, and they will all be from IMDb. And I was actually really surprised because there's a lot of really positive reviews on IMDb, which is very interesting.
I did see that.
In a review written on May 19th, 2007, the user Dr. Wordsmith wrote that this episode of Doctor Who is again showing that this series is getting better, but taking its sweet time to get there. The episode is very reminiscent of The Impossible Planet and the Satan Pit.
Mm-hmm.
But they continued to say that the episode was fast-paced and very scary in places, and they could see why the BBC didn't want to put it on before 7 o'clock. And like most of the episodes of Doctor Who this series, and the last two for that matter, there was a lot of running around, but the episode was clever and surprisingly emotional as well. It also managed to overcome the episode 7 filler syndrome, as these episodes tend to be the blandest ones in the whole series. Like The Long Game, The Idiot's Lantern. All in all, a very well-made, exciting, and tense episode.
I'm glad you said which the other episode 7s were, because I was like, oh wait, what are they? Yeah, but I still like those episodes more than this, and we had our problems with those episodes.
Yeah, but I like them more than this.
Yeah, I do find it interesting that they kind of see this as the series getting better, because I don't know, I think this is just another low point, but then next week really begins like the best episodes of the series. Like, from here on out, it's banger after banger after banger. But the series just takes a really long time to get there, and there are stuff in the first half that I like we like Smith and Jones. I'm partial to Shakespeare Code, but yeah, besides that, it just really takes a long time to get there.
Yeah. The next review is by the user agent_John_Bishop, and he said that it is a horrible shame that this episode is not liked by more people. It is brilliant. It has the feel of a classic sci-fi with a beautiful mix of horror and humor that perfectly fits Doctor Who. The only real problem with it is that it is a remake. It feels exactly like the Impossible Planet Satan Pit episodes, but is better.
What?
Whereas those episodes had a cop-out ending, 42 has a satisfying, suspenseful close. It is an example of an odd Doctor Who phenomenon. This episode would have sucked in any other season, but like Gridlock, because it is in season 3, it somehow managed to be brilliant. This can be seen throughout season 3.
I want to find this person and have them read this review and be like, do you still think 42 isn't better than the Impossible Planet and the Satan Pit? Like, do you stand by these words? Because there's no way. There's no way.
It's what they said all the way back in 2009, and I would hope that they would change their opinion because I agree with you. I'm sorry. This episode is not better than that two-parter from last series. It just isn't.
No, it's not. And people keep talking about like the heart and the humor. And I'm like, where? Like, there are moments like Martha saying bye to her mom is nice. And, you know, I already said like her calling her about the trivia was kind of funny, but not more than like those episodes had way more heart and humor.
Yeah, they did. This didn't.
Yeah.
And this last review is by the user Higgledy Piggledy, and they wrote on May 19th, 2007, that they love Doctor Who and sit down every week to watch it, and they were looking forward to this episode as it had been given such great reviews. But they were disappointed by the end of it on how similar it was to a previous episode in a different series. And to them, it did not even seem that scary, and they are scared easily. The fact that it was based in a space station, which was in trouble, and then again a person being controlled by a force, i.e. the devil / the sun, appeared way too familiar, and it felt like they were watching the same episode with only a few changes, although the emotional factors in this episode were more prominent than the two-parter.
Okay.
Very, very interesting take.
I feel like the people saying that the emotional aspect is better here are people that maybe just didn't like Rose that much.
Or they maybe just didn't like the villain, because I've never, like I mentioned to you in our two-parter, I won't get too into it, but like I would skip those episodes a lot because I didn't like the villain or the possession storyline. So it could have that going as well. But that two-parter had so much more emotion than 42 did. I'm sorry.
Yeah, definitely. Well, to each their own. So I'm curious. I think back then maybe people were just more forgiving, and maybe we are biased because we don't like Chris Chibnall. But I don't know. I'm curious what people think about this now. So let us know, guys, what you think about this. But Haley, what is the heart of this episode?
The heart of this episode is that if you are really close to the sun because you're trying to use it as a fuel source, maybe not. Maybe learn a lesson from Icarus.
Yeah. Do not fly too close to the sun, and do not use the sun for fuel. And if you are, just maybe scan for any life forms first, just to be safe.
Yeah, that goes for any planet, but especially the sun.
Yeah. Who is the star of the show?
That's actually such a great question. And you know what? I'm going to give it to the girl. I don't remember your name. So sorry, Queen. But the one who said, "Oh, kill me now," and then she was killed. She deserved a little bit better, and she made me laugh. Even though dying is not funny. But yeah, I got to give it to her because everyone else, honestly, I don't care about enough.
Yeah, Arena is what I wrote her name down as, and yeah, I completely agree. She is my star of the show as well, because what an icon. What amazing last words.
Mm-hmm.
Rest in peace to my girl.
We love you, Queen.
Anything else we need to say before we go?
I don't believe so, but I am so excited for next week's episode.
So excited.
I can't even explain to you guys.
Well, we will be back next week with Human Nature. But until then, you can follow us on Instagram and TikTok at timey-wimey-pod.
And email us anything and everything to timey-wimey-pod@gmail.com.
And don't forget to leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts.
And with all that said, we will talk to you guys next week. Bye.
Bye. Ta-ra.
Ta-ra.